All right, everyone. Welcome to the Hoover Institution's workshop using text as data and policy analysis. This is a workshop series that features applications of natural language processing, structured human readings, and machine learning methods applied to text as data to examine policy issues across a wide range of fields: economics, history, national security, political science, and other fields. Today, we're thrilled to have Gloria Gennaro and Elliott Ash, and they'll be presenting their paper, Emotion and Reason in Political Language. Elliott, take it away.
Thank you, Justin. So as Justin just said, the title of today's presentation is Emotion and Reason in Political Language. It's joint work with Gloria Gennaro, who is here and will help answer questions towards the end. Thanks for having us. So this paper is, one of the things I love about it is how it just crosses so many fields in social science and humanities. And it's one of the few papers where I can quote Aristotle. An emotional speaker always makes his audience feel with him, even when there is nothing in his arguments, which is why many speakers try to overwhelm their audience by mere noise. But more specifically to our topic today is from Drew Weston. In politics, when reason and emotion collide, emotion invariably wins. So this is some of the motivation. We're going to be talking about emotionality, emotional intensity in political language. This is an old topic, and as the Aristotle example can tell you, more recently, this dichotomy between emotions on the one hand and rationality on the other hand is central to behavioral and social science. And more specifically, there's growing attention to the issue of emotions in politics. In particular, there's this tradition of deliberative democracy, which puts more of an emphasis on reasoning and deliberation towards finding solutions to policy problems. On this more traditional approach, emotional intensity might be a problem. In the area of empirical work, in this recent generation of papers that have started looking at emotionality in text or in audio or even in video, there's papers looking at positive and negative valence. There's some other work looking at specific emotions like joy and anger, and some limited attention, which is going to be our topic today, is emotional intensity. So the research agenda and also the agenda for today's talk is, first, what is the method? This is a text analysis series, and so I'm happy to give you a few details on how to detect emotion and reason in political speech. Second, what can be learned descriptively with this measure of emotionality in the US Congress? And we have data going all the way back to 1858, and we can make these really interesting long-run comparisons and look for patterns in emotional intensity over time. That's from our forthcoming paper in Economic Journal called Emotion and Reason in Political Language. And I'm going to give you a preview to some work in progress that we don't even have a paper yet on what has been the effect of televising congressional debates, that is the C-SPAN network. What's been the effect of C-SPAN on emotional intensity in Congress? So the method. We start off with a corpus. This is what you need for text analysis. We have the universe of speeches from the US Congress from the congressional record from 1858 to 2014. Even after excluding things that aren't about speeches, such as roll calls, bills, and legislation, we have 9.8 million speeches or 9.8 million documents in our data set. We pre-process them following some relatively standard approaches in the text as data literature. We keep nouns, adjectives, and verbs because these parts of speech are more informative about the emotional or rational content of language. And we do some other pre-processing, such as dropping punctuation and word endings. After we have a pre-processed corpus, which is every document is a list of words, we train word embeddings, which I'll talk about more in a second. This is a technology to convert words to vectors. The reason that we do this is we take advantage of this really interesting feature of word embeddings, where In the same way that in a geometric space, the directions in this space correspond to which way you're going, word embeddings convert words and phrases into a semantic space where the directions in that space correspond to semantic meaning. So the classic example is that the translation from man to woman is parallel to the translation from king to queen, with the interpretation that this arrow here corresponds to gender. Similarly, in the word embedding space, there's directions for verb tense, for capitals of countries, and what we have a direction between emotion and reason. So in order to find out that dimension in the space, we start off with a list of words, a lexicon from the Luke project, which is built and validated by some linguistic psychologists, where they have these nice lists of words for cognitive processing. So this is going to correspond to reason in our case, such as causation, comparison, uncertainty, inclusion, exclusion, and then affective processing, which is emotion. So positive and negative emotions, moods, including anxiety, anger, sadness. We take these lexicons, we pre-process them in the same way that we pre-process the congressional speeches, and then we basically find all the locations of all of those words in our embedding space. So after we take these lists of emotion and reason words in our embedding space and look at the words that are near those centroids, we see something that is quite reassuring, that we're capturing our correct dimension of emotion and reason. So here are the positive valent emotion words. Here are the negative valent emotion words. Here are some positive reason or rational words, and here are some negative reason words. And you look at these are, kind of persuasive. They're reassuring that, we're getting smile and serene and thrill versus terrify, frighten, characteristic, discern. There's both positive and negative dimension to both emotion and reason. I think that's also important for our interpretation, that we're not just capturing some positive or positivity or negativity in speech. We're really getting this emotion and reason dimension. So once we have these two poles of emotion and reason, we can scale every document between those two poles. And I can come back to these technicalities in the Q&A if you're curious, but basically, in the same way that we can locate words in this space between emotion and reason, we can also locate speeches. And if you look at some samples, it's persuasive, right? So, the key to whether or not we are going to be successful ending what is a national disgrace is those of you who are watching this program today and others. This is like expressing a lot of emotion. Whereas here, speaker, I rise to seek a clarification from the manager of the bill regarding the agreement reached by conferees on the procedure for future appropriation requests for Indian irrigation projects. That's, that's a reason, a cognitive sentence. But you don't have to take our word for it in terms of just seeing some examples. We also did an extensive human validation where we constructed a big data set of sentence pairs of emotional sentences and cognitive sentences. And we had coders on a crowdsourcing platform annotate which sentence is more emotional, which sentence is more logical. And then we scored the performance of our emotionality metric based on these annotations. So this is our main statistics on the human validation. You can see that overall, our emotionality detector from text corresponds to human judgment about 87% of the time. If you limit to the coders who pass an English comprehension test, or for the sentence pairs where the two coders agreed, it's even higher. It's about over 92% accurate. And given that we're going to be looking over 16 decades, 160 years of the congressional record, we also wanted to check that it's valid across decades, and it is. So if we look at even at the very old speeches, it's over 84, 85% accurate. And so we have some reassurance that we can make long run comparisons over time.
Elliott, can I just ask a quick question
Sure.
on this? I think this is just one of the more fascinating validation issues. And one concern that this takes care of is that, simply we just don't know much about what's going on, 160 years ago with the language. A separate concern, though, is that the model and the coders agree on emotionality, which is different from, say, how a mid-19th century viewer of the Senate would have viewed emotionality. Can you
Yes.
talk at all about how one
Sure.
might deal with that, or if it's possible?
It's an interesting difficulty, and yeah, of course, ideally we could go back in time, right, and ask someone from the late 1800s, would you perceive this speech as being more emotional than this speech? And of course, we can't do that. One idea we had was to maybe try to recruit older people, people in like older cohorts, and see if that made a difference. We haven't done that yet. We just use the annotators on the crowdsourcing platform. What I would say is that if you look at the statistics about are you unsure or not, those don't change that much over time, which I think is a bit reassuring. It could just be that we kind of lucked out in the sense that in this setting, and something that's kind of intuitive to humans of emotion and cognition, we don't have this problem. I think that something more more let's say implicit, like is this person being sarcastic? There's no, I think that would be asking too much of the annotators, especially when you go back this far in time. I think it's something that if our model doesn't capture sarcasm, so it could be that they say something that is on paper very deliberative, but the way they intone it could be very emotive, and our model would miss it. I think we just have to we have to make some assumptions that may be strong or not, depending on your point of view, that those shares haven't changed significantly over time. So like that the percentage of the time that when people are kind of being clearly emotional versus like sarcastically emotional, that isn't too different now than it was 100 years ago. But I mean, I think that it's possible that we could, another way to get at this is to maybe ask some historians, like people who are familiar with the milieu. We haven't done that yet either, but it would be great. So did you have another thought about that, and a way we could address it? Or
my thought was historians.
Oh yeah.
I just think that I think it's like an inherent difficulty. It doesn't mean you shouldn't try to do it, but historians are another group of people who are like familiar with reading the language and think deeply about what people mean when they say particular things, in this decade as opposed to another decade. And so
no, and actually, I mean, it seemed like a bit of a big ask when we were starting this, but now that I think about it, we wouldn't have to make a huge sample, and maybe just do even the earlier years. I like that. We'll try it. So if you're curious about this emotionality detector using text, we have an open source package that does it with just a few lines of code. We already have we even have a sample corpus of tweets that you could run it and get the emotionality scores for tweets by politicians. So if you end up using it, I'd love to hear from you to see how it worked. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you a bit about our descriptive evidence from US Congress, going back to 1858, which is the topic of our first paper, Emotion and Reason in Political Language. So this is our main time series figure where the discussion that Justin and I just had is most relevant. In order for these long run comparisons of emotionality over time to be valid, then our measurement has to be valid over these long time periods. And what you'd be worried about potentially is that our measure of emotion and reason words are biased because it's from just a recent lexicon that just came out, 10 years ago. And the set of words that are emotional or not might be different 100 years ago. We can address that already to some point because we ask people to compare sentences and speeches from the early time period and say, are they more emotional and reasonable than the other? But it could be that even the recent annotators don't understand the language around emotionality, or the signifiers of emotionality might be different now. But with all of those caveats, I think from looking at examples from back in the day, and we have some examples from every decade in the paper, you can see, for me, it was quite intuitive that they were emotional versus reasonable, even in the historical time period. But some other validation we have is that this emotionality measure, it spikes in times of war. So during the Civil War, World War I, World War II, we see spikes on it. And this one reason this is intuitive, I think, is that we also ran a topic model on the corpus, and when they're talking about the military and veterans and like the American dream and the national narrative and patriotism, those are very emotive topics. And so we see that when they're talking more about war and veterans, you see more emotionality. But really, I think the most striking pattern in this graph is starting in the late 1970s, there's just been this big shift, big increase in emotionality, especially in the House of Representatives, but also in the Senate. I think for those interested in US politics, the fact that the emotionality was the same for such a long time, I think is actually kind of interesting. But then the fact that it's diverged in the last 40, 50 years is also quite interesting. Aaron, I see your question. That's an interesting issue, the fact that there's this dip right here. But I'll come back to that because it's the short answer is we don't know for sure. But so I'd like to come back to that. So it should have a longer discussion. What I can say is that this isn't driven by shifts in the broader society. So I'm not sure if I have a link to it, but if you look at emotionality, like in fiction or like in Google Books, something like that, that's actually all going down. So this is not driven by just changes in discourse generally. It's specific to politics. So as I mentioned a second ago, the national narrative, for example, like they're talking about kind of patriotism, those are the most emotional topics in Congress, whereas procedure is the least emotional. So that makes sense, right? I should also say that these trends here, they're not driven by the procedure topic. So if we drop the procedure topic, these are still there. The other thing that I thought was interesting is the difference between the political parties in emotionality. So if we compare the topics by the political parties, Republicans are most emotive in fiscal policy when they're talking about taxes. So I love this as like a public finance economist, that Republicans, which are trying to protect unequal distribution of income, they use all these emotional appeals and emotional arguments to defend low taxes. When you look at Democrats, they're using more emotion, some on social issues, which I think makes sense, but also like for workers and for tribute to other congressmen and about governance. So when you split up the political parties by their this is in the House of Representatives, by their emotionality, you see something interesting, that there isn't one party that's always more emotive than the other. It really tends to follow who's the minority versus majority party, who has more seats in the House. And so you can see it most clearly here that when the Democrats were in the majority, Republicans had more emotions. But then when Republicans gained the majority, Democrats were more emotional. And I think this is interesting. Like, you know, when you're the minority party, you need to fight to get more votes, to try to reclaim the majority, or to fight for your priorities. And so the minority party is usually the more emotive one.
That
we have a few more.
Elliot, just real quick, that
Yes.
holds as well if you drop procedure.
Yes, Gloria, is that the case? Yeah, I think that's a good question, because especially here, you'd expect, like, if you're like the speaker, if you have the Speaker of the House, for example, you cover more procedural topics. Yeah, and if you just condition on topics they cover, this also goes through. So actually, this is one thing I wanted to mention. This is emotionality in broader society using Google Books. You can see it's going down. So it's a much different trend than we see in the Congress. Okay, so I wanted to go back to, so this is, as I mentioned, there's this really striking increase since the late 1970s. This is when C-SPAN 1 began broadcasting on the House of Representatives on television. C-SPAN 2 is when the Senate started broadcasting on television. And so we saw this, we're like, oh, you know, maybe that's a coincidence. But we're trying to figure out if there's something else like really important happening at that time. But I think that the speeches going on TV was a big change, and it was perceived so as so at the time. Jacqueline, I'm gonna come back to that question in the Q&A. Now we're going to focus on the effect of televised debates, the effect of C-SPAN on emotional rhetoric. And this is part of this specific set of issues related to emotional appeals and polarization and populism. Is that, you know, could this be a downside of transparency? That, you know, when politicians are living in this deliberative plane and talking to each other and talking to experts, maybe they'll have more, you know, reasoned discussions, and there'll be this heightened discourse. But when you break that wall down, and congressmen and politicians are talking directly to voters, they might have to dumb down the rhetoric, and you might get more, more like polarized or partisan or emotional debates. And we can actually look at this question using C-SPAN as a natural experiment. When C-SPAN comes in, or when C-SPAN viewership goes up, does emotionality go up in political debates? And so the first way we do this is a differences and differences approach. C-SPAN began broadcasting in the House in 1979, and it didn't start broadcasting in the Senate until 7 years later. And so this is like a nice just diff and diff, right? Where we can estimate the effect of the C-SPAN introduction on the House members using the senators as a control group. And our estimation strategy is, you know, really straightforward here. We just estimate the leads and lags of the introduction of C-SPAN using a fixed effect for the House relative to the Senate, and year fixed effects, and standard errors clustered by legislator. So we need parallel trends is our identification assumption here. And I think practically what this means is that there wasn't anything else happening in 1979 in the House that would have dramatically changed emotionality of speeches. And so if you know some congressional historians, or you can think of something, I'd be really curious to hear about that. This is what the result looks like, the event study estimates. So 1979, this is when C-SPAN was introduced. We leave out 1978, so all of the estimates are relative to 1978. And you can see that there's not much of a pre-trend, but within a year or two of the introduction of C-SPAN, there's a statistical increase in the use of emotional rhetoric relative to the Senate. So you can see that beforehand, relative to they were on parallel trends, but afterward, the House started diverging and becoming more emotional relative to the Senate. If you limit to the incumbents, So these are like, only the people that had been elected before 1979. There's still kind of a positive effect, but it's definitely smaller and noisier. And that's consistent with what we find in terms of looking for a selection effect, where if we do an event study in starting year, so the year that the congressman or the senator came in, rather than the current year, we see a positive selection effect, where what this means is that new congressmen, so newly elected, they're just now joining the Congress, they are more emotional relative to the senators that were also starting right after the House introduced C-SPAN. So we're still working on this. There could be a number of reasons for this, but this is consistent with when television comes on, a new breed of more emotive congressmen are joining the House of Representatives. Okay, so I know I'm getting a bit close to over time, but there's one more thing I wanted to show you. We also wanted to compare across congressional districts. If more constituents watch C-SPAN, does the congressman use more emotion in their language? The problem with that is that those are endogenous, right? That like it could be that someone is more a congressman is more emotional, and people watch more C-SPAN for some different correlational reason. We are able to take advantage of the fact that C-SPAN channel position. So when you turn on your TV, C-SPAN might be number 15 or it might be number 85. If it's number 15, you're much more likely to watch a little bit. But if it's number 85 or number 105, you're never going to watch it. And we didn't invent this, but this channel position numbering can be used as an instrumental variable in IV analysis. And we construct this instrument of C-SPAN channel position. We can show that it's relevant. It does affect viewership, and it seems to satisfy instrument validity in terms of it's not correlated with other characteristics predicting emotionality. Our estimating equations for IV are pretty standard. We have a first stage where we instrument viewership using the channel position. And then in the second stage, we estimate the effect on emotionality of instrumented viewership. Here's the first stage. So as I was just mentioning, kind of conceptually, as the C-SPAN position goes up, it goes from 10 to 20 to 30 to 40, 50, people watch C-SPAN less. And so you can see this causal effect of the channel position on viewership. And then we ask, does this same variation in channel position affect the emotionality of the congressman in that office? And it turns out the answer is yes. So the places where people watch less C-SPAN because it has a higher channel position, the emotionality of the congressman in those districts is lower. Is lower. So higher viewership of C-SPAN increases emotionality. And so if you do this in the two-stage least squares framework using different specifications and controls and things, we see this positive and significant effect with a strong first stage F statistic. So consistent with the fact that these diff results that I showed at the beginning do have a causal interpretation, even today, based on exogenous variation in viewership from the channel position. So to sum up, we have a new measure of emotive versus cognitive speech that combines dictionary methods and word embeddings. Emotionality increases in times of conflict and when politicians seek empowerment. And we have a higher television visibility of congressmen causally increased emotional intensity. Before I wrap up, Steve, do you have a question?
I'll wait till you're done.
Well, this is the last piece. We have many open substantive questions, such as we looked at television, but what about elections? Maybe there's an effect of that on emotionality. Is there a link between emotionality and polarization? And really, does emotionality influence voters or not? That's still kind of an open question. And we think it would be quite interesting to apply this method to other corpora and potentially to experimental settings. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to the questions. And should we start with Steve?
So let me go. So I have three sets of comments. Two are methodological. One relates to one of the claims you just put on the last slide, is that emotionality goes up in times of war. They're all connected, as you'll see. So you didn't go too deeply into the methodology in your remarks today, but I looked at the paper. You start with dictionaries for emotionality words, affective words, and cognitive words, which is fine. And you use those coupled with word embedding technology to kind of construct your underlying measures of emotionality and cognition at the sentence level and the speech level. So here's the first methodological comment. It pertains to something that gets a fair bit of attention in the paper, but not in your remarks today, but it's underlying my other remarks, so I'm going to talk about it anyway. Your use of the dictionary method strikes me as the way it's implemented is highly problematic for the following reason, and makes dictionary methods look worse than they are. And I just want to preface this by saying I think word embeddings are the right way to go for what you're doing. But dictionaries have their uses too. But the way you set up the dictionary approach, you start with fairly long lists of words. And in those words will be many words, and I'll give some examples in a minute, that are likely to generate lots of false positives, okay? And I think when you apply dictionary methods, if you're trying to optimize the performance of dictionary methods, you have to think about fine-tuning the dictionary list to get rid of the terms that generate high false positives without providing much in the way of true positives, conditional on all the other words. And there's a bunch of details we can come back to about how to do that in the the non-recorded session. But the bottom line is, and here's some examples. If you go, I looked at your list of emotional words. Okay, so very high on that list, and this is by way of example, are words like defense, fight, attack, kill, defend, violence, war, assault. Okay, well, what is the one thing that strikes me about those words? It would be almost impossible to give a speech, say in 1940, about Germany's invasion of France and the Low Countries without using those words, okay? Even if the speech were purely factual in nature, or if it just was highly cognitive, but that would get scored in your dictionary method as an emotive speech. So those are words that I think are likely to generate very high false positive rates in some particular settings, maybe not on average. So this is why your current audit method wouldn't pick it up. And so you can see now why I'm beginning to question the claim that emotionality goes up around times of war. Now, when you move to your embeddings methodology, you're building on those dictionaries. Okay, so to some extent, even your embedding methodology is going to inherit aspects of what's in the dictionaries. So for the same reason, I'm skeptical about the war one in particular with the dictionary, I'm still skeptical about it with respect to the embedding technologies. All right, so those are really my first two comments, because I've already made it clear why I'm skeptical about the claim that emotionality goes up around about speeches about war. That might be right. I don't have strong priors one way or the other, but I don't think the evidence is persuasive. Let me get to my third comment, which is constructive. And as I said, I think some of the difficulties I just identified with your implementation of the dictionary method will feed into your implementation of the embedding method. But what I would do to address that is, first, you described your audit as large scale. I view it as pretty modest scale. I'd scale it up by at least an order of magnitude. I don't think it's that expensive to do. Then I would use it in the following way. I'd take the audits and I'd go find the cases where there's where humans say it's not about emotionality, for example, and the dictionary-based approach, then go look what terms are appearing in there that intersect with your emotionality dictionary. That's telling you it's a false positive. I'd use that approach to go back and refine my dictionary. There's other approaches you could do. I think you'd end up shrinking your dictionary. You might also expand it a bit. You'd shrink your dictionary. Then redo your embedding approach, okay, on top of this newly refined dictionary that's now a better base, I think, for going forward. I'm willing to bet you're going to get better performance on your embedding methodology as well if you kind of take this iterative approach. And you could do it with your existing audit, okay, but I think you'd get more mileage out if you just scale up your audit. So we can talk more about details, or you can, or now or later, but that's kind of the 3 sets of comments.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve. So we faced a bit of a trade-off when we were deciding the lexicon, because we felt that if we tried to make our own lexicon, then we would have been accused of, kind of being too subjective. And so that was the reason that we went with the Luke one. I agree with you that I think the fact that there's words like fight and kill in the lexicon, those are excellent examples. That those tend to be emotional, right? Like those are emotive terms, or at least they appear in emotive contexts. But they're in our context of political discourse, they're entangled with a topic, right, of defense or war or military or veterans issues. And especially, I mentioned that patriotism was the most emotive topic, but that's kind of circular when you think about the fact that there are kind of war or patriotism related words in the lexicon. So it's almost like a tautological, right? So I take that on board. I think that's a fair point. I do think that it makes a lot of sense to try a more focused dictionary that is in particular has the goal of excluding words that are not about a topic in the political case. So we haven't done that. I think it's something that we should try it both ways, where we actually go through and just try to make a much more trimmed down dictionary that is using words that are clearly about emotion but aren't about a political topic. And then I like the idea of using our annotations as a way to further
cull
the dictionary.
You can just optimize the dictionary to minimize the errors against the human classifications.
Yeah, no, I think that redoing our analysis with this alternative, it actually might work much better. So yeah, we should try that.
Maybe this is a good opportunity to re-engage with Erin's question as well, because one interpretation of her question was that it's a counterexample to the war claim. I don't want to put words in. Yeah. Right.
During the run up to Vietnam, I think that's a useful point. And what Steve is outlining could be a reason for that. Gloria and I aren't U.S. historians, so we did notice that there was this dip in the 60s and 70s. Given that that was also the time when there was a lot of social division happening, it's surprising, right? So we haven't had a good explanation of that yet. But Erin, did you want to add something to that? You said, I see you have another question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Sorry, it's much easier to sort of say this than type it in the box. So really fantastic paper. Elliott and Gloria, really enjoyed hearing the presentation. So my question is, how is your emotionality different than sort of more basic and standard measures of affect? So I'm thinking like the Harvard General Inquirer dictionaries, where you have like long lists of positive and negative words. They have more tailored dictionaries like overstated versus understated, virtue versus vice. So I wonder how yours is an improvement over that, and sort of you could show us that it's just simply showing us the correlation of those sort of like rudimentary measures with your measure of emotionality to sort of help. I think in the paper that would help sell the method. And I'm just curious. I'm curious if you looked into that at all.
So there's a number of these emotion lexicons, and if I understand what you're saying correctly, a lot of what these standard measures of emotionality in NLP before this one, they were just counting words that were in different lexicons, or they might have a weight attached to it, and so it's like a kind of a weighted average of the emotion words added up for a document. We haven't systematically compared those, but I'd like to, just to see which of these matches up well with our annotations. If we just used a standard dictionary count based on the LIWC, the Luke lexicon, then it was quite a bit significantly worse than our emotionality measure. But we haven't tried all the different lexicons. I will say that this is relevant to Steve's point, is that those most of those other lexicons for emotion words, besides the one that we used, have way more words than LIWC does. So I think that Steve's comment would apply with even more would apply even more to those other lexicons. Gloria, did you want to add something there?
I wanted to mention a validation that we did by dropping all sentences that do not include words that are in our dictionaries. Now, of course, the embedding that are trained and the direction is calculated based on our dictionary, but I would be very surprised to find that actually, changing words to words that are extremely similar in meaning would affect that, because really like the dependence between our measure and the presence of a word that appears in the dictionary is very, very low. So the method is extremely strong to these changes.
Perhaps we can have Jacqueline ask her question. Tara, could we have Jacqueline Schneider able to talk?
Hi, thanks. This has been a really fascinating conversation. And I'll admit my the text analysis I've done has all been by hand. So it's always, which is cumbersome. It has different problems. But one of the things that that I've struggled with in the past when doing text analysis, especially when trying to understand something more than just like positive, negative variance, is off the cuff remarks versus prepared speeches. And in my work, there were very significant differences, both in like sentence syntax, obviously, but really in the emotion and that people use when they're having these discussions off the cuff versus prepared remarks. So I don't know if you can even go back and figure out which of these remarks are extemporaneous versus pre-prepared. But I was wondering whether you looked at that and whether that had any impact on emotionality.
So what I can say is that's not in the metadata. So we don't have any we don't have a clear assignment of speeches like that. I like that idea though, and one kind of shortcut to doing that would be to look at compare speeches that are scheduled, like the House represents the House speaker recognizes somebody to give a speech in defense of a bill, versus when there's like debate in between congressmen, like when they're actually talking to each other. That's something we haven't done, but I like that.
Can we have Frank Fan able to ask a question? Okay, Frank might be having some issues patching through.
I can read that. So the short answer is no. That if you look at our main figure of just the overall time series averages across speeches in the House and Senate, the Senate isn't decreasing. It's just increasing more slowly. One way to understand your question is, when C-SPAN was introduced in the House, does that affect the Senate in some indirect way? I hadn't thought of that, but we should consider it, since we're using the Senate as a control group.
Is the Senate increasing more slowly? Is that just a phenomenon of slower turnover in the Senate, and so this selection effect you documented earlier takes longer to kick in?
That's an interesting idea. I hadn't made that connection, but that's a nice. That I'm sure that's part of it. Yeah, so I'll make a note of that.
So I have a question just about just thinking through what emotional means and like getting a precise definition of that. And so in part of it, I think comes from Luke, which if I'm recalling is about like they ask people to evaluate words sort of independently and get like a sort of emotive reaction to that. And I'm curious how that translates over into politics in the evaluation here. I think it intersects with Steve's comments as well. Is it the case that simply discussing war is inherently more emotional? We cannot get around that fact. It will elicit a more emotive reaction. And if that's the case, it would be perhaps nice to know if it's simply the case that war is being discussed more often, and it's also eliciting a sort of like sad emotive reaction. And other times that, there could be like periods of happiness. But I guess if we're sort of pulling apart what the emotions are, it would also be interesting to know if politics have become more doom and gloom over time, which has been a suggestion that's been made. If there was ever a period where politicians were eliciting an emotion of happiness on the Senate floor, because then I think it also helps us to understand the words that should be included and the actual thing that we're measuring, so we can think through the validations a little bit better.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, and I mean we can only take this kind of so far in disentangling topics from emotions, and everything is context specific, and the Luke it includes like the word happy, right? But you can imagine someone saying, I was not happy that this happened, using word embeddings. We're not using any context sensitive. I think this is something that we should try. We can do. It's the technology for getting at contextualized word representations and document representations is improving. There are advantages of using just the word level ones as well. If we tried to use using kind of a supervised classifier where we use just the human annotations and tried to reproduce those, that's another reasonable approach to this. I think that the issues of our measure being valid back in time, I think that would be a disadvantage of the supervised learning approach, is that I think that any problems with using a modern set of annotations and modern set of word lists would be more of a problem for trying to make a measure that's valid back in time. So that's a reason to use this approach. That being said, all of our substantive results, like for example, looking at the more polarized members of Congress in terms of their roll call votes, they're more emotional. Women are more emotional. The majority minority result that I mentioned, those are all robust using topic fixed effects. So we know that it's not driven just by topics, at least as far as those topics are captured by LDA model. That has its own caveats, but we have some reassurance along that direction. Something that I think is also relevant to Steve's point earlier. We should make the time series dropping the war topic and see if we still see those spikes, because that would be actually interesting to see, is for the non-war topics, is there a spike during times of wars? Because that would be much more relevant to this question.
Okay, so I think Victor has a question. Victor.
Oh yeah, hi, good to be here. Hi everyone. So I wonder whether you guys have analyzed syntactic phenomena, and especially those which are recognized by cognitive psychology as indicative of emotion, because a dictionary that pertains to the semantic dimension. I wonder whether you went into any syntactic analysis. Thank you.
No, we haven't. We're using just word embeddings, which is kind of breaking down the syntactic content of sentences, and we're just using the nouns, adjectives, and verbs and adverbs. Maybe I'm not familiar with what you're referring to, but I'd be curious to hear about it. So if you could send an email with some links to it, I'd be curious to look at it.
Yeah, listen, I'm not an expert. I just thought that, for instance, if in intention people might to repeat words more frequently, stuff like that. So there's like a huge literature about it, and it's maybe you know, more adequate than building a dictionary, because that to me just seems very indirect. And what Steve said, in a hostile situation, words such as conflict, war, strategy, those are natural phenomena.
Just to follow up on that comment. So this is a semi-constructive suggestion. Because I was thinking along similar lines. You could imagine going to a short little textbook on rhetoric. Okay, well, they'll tell you the 25 rhetorical tools to use. And I think it's worthwhile to go through and scan those and see whether there's any of them that you could operationalize, you know, in an automated way. And the one Victor just suggested would be easy to automate. Like one of the things I remember from rhetoric, if I remember it correctly, is, you know, sets of threes is kind of a rhetorical device. You know, you speak in sets of threes, sometimes the same word, sometimes the same term. Those are things you could easily automate, you know, analyze in an automated way, but there may be others. And then that would lead to the question, well, when people are speaking in emotional language, do they rely on certain rhetorical tools more often than when they speak when they're trying to appeal to reason? My guess is they do, but it would be very interesting to document that and to show which rhetorical tools, especially if it were rhetorical tools designed to obfuscate, which I think would be a complement to emotional speech, at least in some settings.
Yeah, interesting. A couple of thoughts on that. So, you know, one of it would be great if they had exclamation points in there, right? Like, so like that, you know, that would help us. They were, you know, being emotive, but the problem there is that, you know, that would be written by the people who were transcribing the congressional record rather than people that were speaking. Another way around this would be, well, let's get the audio, let's get the recordings, and then use that and use, like, you know, measures of pitch or volume or something. There are a couple of recent papers doing this that are pretty nice. You of course can't go back as far in time using the audio, but you can imagine that trying to get the text features that are associated with audio emotionality. I think those are some interesting directions. The idea of looking at you know, different rhetorical strategies is also nice. We'll think about that. But I guess, you know, anything that's like kind of punctuation based and things we couldn't do because that might come from the transcriptions rather than from the speech.
Okay, so Ken Cottrell has a question. Perhaps we can give Ken the ability to talk.
Thank you, and thank you. Very interesting talk. A lot of focus on C-SPAN, but there's a lot of things around that time that are new, like the internet, social media, the cable news networks. Any thought as to is the impact C-SPAN? Is it these other things? Has any thought been given to that?
Interesting. Yes. So I guess C-SPAN actually was founded not that long after. Sorry, CNN was founded not that long after. So we should think about that. You know, Fox and MSNBC didn't start till the late 90s. So at least in terms of the earlier increase, I don't think it's due to Fox and MSNBC.
Okay.
But we haven't done this yet, but we should. Or Gloria, I don't think we did it, where we basically ran like the channel position analysis with Fox and CNN and MSNBC. We didn't try that yet, right?
No, but there's in terms of instrumentation strategy, there's a paper out there in the literature already. I don't remember what the outcome variable was, that uses the rollout of cable news across different parts of the country. Cable news access to CNN, Fox, MSNBC, because it didn't happen uniformly across the country. It happened at different times. So it seems like a more powerful version of actually your positioning instrument that you're currently using, because I would think that, you know, more important than where a particular channel like C-SPAN is positioned is whether you can access it at all.
Yeah. So this is the Delavingne and Kaplan paper looking at the rollout of Fox News. They looked at the effect of voting. Of course, it'd be nice if we could do that, but C-SPAN had been around for a long time. So the problem is that the Nielsen data that documents where channels are available, it only goes back to 1998 or 1997. And so, Fox News and MSNBC and CNN, Fox News and MSNBC were still being rolled out then. And so you can look at when they start,
even the rollout of broadcast TV. That happened quite unevenly across the country. So it suggests the availability of an instrumentation strategy in earlier decades. It's similar in spirit to the one you currently use.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, right. Actually, yeah. So there's I think the Ginsco and Shapiro have a paper on the rollout of TV early on. If we could match those to congressional districts, that would be pretty nice, actually. Yeah, I like it. Yeah.
I have a related thought, but it would be less amenable to sort of an instrumentation strategy. It seems to me that if I'm thinking about what members of Congress are doing, they're a little less focused on someone watching them at C-SPAN at the moment and much more interested in getting some media coverage subsequent to this speech. And so, I know that a big thing senators are doing now is they're trying to get their speeches on either, Maddow or Hannity. And so they, spend a lot of time thinking about how they can go about doing that or get it covered on NPR. Back, before you have those options available, you could imagine wanting to give a speech that gets the attention of the AP beat reporter who's up in the gallery, or some local press officer. And so that's obviously harder for instrumentation purposes. There's a few things you could do. So one would be our local bureaus being shut down for newspapers in the person's area. That would suggest a sort of reverse. There's not the sort of return that you'd get from placing in local news. Another thing you can do to sort of reverse the analysis is to establish, maybe I'm wrong about this sort of incentive being there. It'd be interesting to know what speeches get picked up by Fox, MSNBC, CNN, or local news. If those are the most emotional speeches, obviously it's not establishing a causal effect, but it gives you some indication that this is the information available to press offices, and those press offices would be inferring that this is what you have to do to get that sort of national attention that certainly a lot of representatives want.
Yeah, I really like that. Actually, we're doing that.
Awesome.
We've matched up. There's caveats to this. We're working the data, but we have a really nice data set of local news paper articles, and we've started matching those congressional districts, and so we can see, does C-SPAN coverage, result in that congressman being quoted or mentioned more often in local news, and is the emotionality of the speech related to it? It could be pretty nice, but we don't have the results yet. I wanted to respond to a couple of things earlier that I thought of. So this related to one of the conversation we had with Steve and Victor about the other aspects of speech, but besides the other aspects of emotionality besides the semantic content. I should mention that we also made a lot of readability. We made some kind of basic readability measures, so sentence length and word length, and those don't have the same trend as emotionality. We also control for it for those readability measures in our regression. So we know that any of our substantive results are not driven by changes in readability, according to a very blunt measure of sentence length and word length. Somebody also mentioned what's the effect of internet on emotionality, which I think is very interesting because we think of the internet as being polarizing. On the other hand, in the early years of the internet, it was all text, right? So maybe that would you might encourage congressmen to be a bit more deliberative, because people will read it rather than watch it on TV. And then finally, the Justin's idea of looking at local papers changing and that having a kind of a differential effect of C-SPAN. I like that. So we'll look into it. There's the Snyder and Stromberg 2010 JPE paper where they have the congruence of congressional districts and newspaper markets. So we started merging that in, and so that's going to give us another source of variation and transparency, which it would be quite interesting to see. Does newspaper transparency, is that different than TV transparency? We'll be able to check that.
Fantastic. Okay, so this is going to conclude the recorded component of the talk. We're going to stop here. We'll take a 30-second break. We'll let everyone enter in, and then we'll reconvene with some more specific and nuts and bolts questions. So Elliott and Gloria, thank you. That was a fascinating paper.
Thank you.
Oh.